Professor Lee, I was asking you about arrangements at the Royal Free Centre. The Royal Free was part of the North East Thames region, but also I think to some extent part also of the North West Thames region. Is that right?
Yes. This was, of course, prior to us becoming a trust in 1991, but there were two regions and patients came from both areas.
And we know that there were regular meetings of a haemophilia working party of the North East Thames region, which were attended by Dr. Colvin and Dr. Kernoff. What regional transfusion centre or centres did the Royal Free predominantly deal with in the 80s?
To North London.
Was that the one in Edgware?
Yes.
Okay. In your evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal, you described Dr. Kernoff as a real stickler for detail. Could you just expand upon that?
I suppose everything he did needed to be recorded. And I suppose it's really underscored with the fact that one of the very early things he did at the Royal Free in 1979-80 was that he recruited a computer person to get a computer that could record all the treatments that patients had and the numbers of the batches of concentrate. And, to set that in context, nowadays all of us have computers in our hands, and mobile phones. I didn't have a computer on my desk at the Royal Free until 1994. The idea that there was a computer in 1980 is quite extraordinary. So that was one area that he was a stickler for detail. The other thing, which I was on the receiving end, and we're going to go on to talk about the way we disseminated the information that we were finding, I wrote a lot of that. And he would go through it with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that the facts were right, the dates were right. And I suppose that stickler for detail, really. He also, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, these days we have clinical governance. Everybody talks about governance. Dr. Kernoff, as early, I think, as 1980, actually set up a management structure in the Haemophilia Centre and had regular management meetings of the key individuals who were leading each section, so the laboratory, the nursing, the medical, the counselling. And I think that was also a kind of reflection of his stickler for detail. The other thing that I think is also reflects it is that, these days we can go online and get any kind of information through PubMed or anything like that. In those days, it was all paper-bound, and in his office, he had a filing cabinet, and he had file cards, and any publication that he was aware of or that was important, it was put on this file card, and so that he had a kind of almost a very primitive kind of PubMed, if you like. So he was a stickler for detail.
Do you happen to know what became of that card file?
No.
If we have up on screen, please, Henry, again, the transcript of Professor Lee's evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal, LIND 0000326. And if we could go to page 15, please, Henry. Just picking it up halfway down the page, you were asked questions, and I'm going to ask you similar questions in a few moments, Professor Lee, about the treating practice at the Royal Free, starting with 1983. You explained that you were working very closely with Peter Kernoff, and you say this, so I was party to his thoughts, and we used to discuss these things in that period, but it was his clinical decision. And that's correct.
Yes.
But before we look then in a little more detail at the treating practices, just one further question about Dr. Kernoff. You've mentioned that he worked in Oxford under Dr. Ritzer, or worked with Dr. Ritzer. What, if anything, can you tell us about the relationships he had with other reference centre directors, in particular Dr. Ritzer and Professor Bloom?
And Professor who?
Bloom.
I know particularly about Dr. Ritzer. I don't know that I know about his relationship with Professor Bloom. And the relationship with Dr. Ritzer was that, you know, Oxford was the pioneering centre in the UK for haemophilia, with Rosemary Biggs and Macfarlane, and then the UK HCDO was set up and initially as a group of doctors in the country who knew about haemophilia. Because it's so rare, she had recognised that your average GP or even hospital haematologist was unlikely to see a person with haemophilia, and therefore it was important to bring together people who had knowledge in order to be able to know what was the best treatment for people. And she was at Oxford with Macfarlane, and then Macfarlane retired, and then she retired, and Dr. Ritzer came down from Scotland to be the director, and Dr. Kernoff, as I understand it, was doing work towards an MD at London for London University, which is where he trained at the London. And I think initially his topic was to look at why people with haemophilia had hematuria, blood in their urine. But actually he changed because it became quite a problem, an emerging problem, I suppose, in haemophilia, and that was inhibitors. He did a thesis on inhibitors, and Dr. Ritzer was his supervisor, and I'm sure that Dr. Kernoff learnt about haemophilia through Dr. Ritzer. Oxford at that time was beginning to make concentrates. Macfarlane had realised that if you were going to provide enough blood to make concentrates for the haemophilia population of the UK, which then had been, I think, approximately 500 had been identified patients, you would need an enormous amount of blood. And therefore they started making concentrates from bovine concentrates, animal concentrates. And in fact, the very first tooth extractions for haemophilia were actually done under bovine concentrate. And, you know, for a patient with haemophilia, your teeth, if I had a tooth out, it was terrible. And people could bleed to death with that. So this was quite remarkable. One of the problems about that early concentrate, bovine concentrate, is that it developed inhibitors, antibodies. And so Dr. Kernoff had moved in towards trying to look at what are these antibodies about because of that experience. And Dr. Ritzer had clearly been the clinical person looking after such patients and involved in the development of these concentrates, following on from Macfarlane and Biggs. So I think the relationship was really like an apprentice really. I think in that history document, Dr. Ritzer describes about sitting by patients' bedsides, transfusing cryoprecipitate. I mean, so Dr. Kernoff would have learnt about haemophilia from Ritzer, and clearly, certainly in my own career, those of my teachers who are still alive, you go on having a respect and a collaboration with them in the sense of maybe asking them for advice or whatever. So I think that explains their relationship. But I do not know the relationship between Professor Bloom and Dr. Kernoff. Of course, I knew Professor Bloom, extraordinary physician, and his contribution to people with inherited bleeding disorders was that he began to understand about von Willebrand disease. I can remember in my training and revision for MRC PATH, there was still an idea that von Willebrand factor, the idea that it was separate and was insignificant was ill understood, and it was largely Arthur Bloom who understood that, and he actually came and taught us on that training course in London at that time. But to go back to your first question, I don't know about Dr. Kernoff and Professor Bloom.
I'm going to ask you about the treatment policies at the Royal Free, largely from around 1983 onwards. Similar questions to those you were asked at the Lindsay Tribunal. But before we do that, I just wanted to look at one earlier document with you. It predates your time at the Royal Free, Professor Lee. I just want to go through it with you. It's BART 0000913, please, Henry. So you'll see, Professor Lee, this is a letter from Dr. Kernoff to the local health authority, Camden and Islington Health Authority, in June of 1980. It's a discussion about what are going to be the purchasing arrangements in terms of commercial concentrate. So we can see in the first paragraph, refers to the view of the medical members of the adjudication panel, himself and Dr. Colvin, on the tenders submitted for this contract. Now, you've described how when you became director, you didn't have a role in contractual relationships or choice between tenders, and we'll look at that later. Were you aware of this adjudication panel system? Was it a system still in operation when you took over as director?
I don't know. This is 1980. I wasn't there. I don't know.
So by the time you took over as director, was it a panel that you had to dismantle, or was it something that you know nothing about?
When I became... I had nothing to do with the purchasing or the decision about which concentrate to make, to have, until 1991, when I became director. And when I became director, it was the same time as the Royal Free became a trust. So there's no more North East Thames and North West Thames. And there was a completely different... The Royal Free had to get its own money in. And from that point onwards, the purchasing was actually done by the supplies department. And then it was changed to the chief pharmacist, but largely, actually, very good advice I had from my husband that I should never get involved in negotiations about which pharmaceutical company or those kind of negotiations. And there was a manager, he was the chief scientist, called Angus McCraw. And eventually they changed from supplies to the pharmacist of the hospital, and together with Angus McCraw, they did all the negotiating. And the only decision making from the point that I was making the decisions was that I would make a decision about which was the right type of concentrate. So the types of concentrate were, is it going to be plasma derived? Is it going to be high purity? Is it later, is it going to be recombinant? And that, as far as I was able, was done through what was the guideline from the UK HCDO at that time. So it was a type. I didn't have anything to do with the decision as to which company to go with.
If we go back to
or the prices, which was, I think I should just. I think it's important, if you'll allow me, to just talk a little bit about what I know from 1991 about buying. The Royal Free, when it became a trust, was very clear that managers looked after money, doctors look after patients, which is probably how it should be. So the contracts were not in the medical hands. And other institutions, other hospitals who weren't actually trust yet, but then they became trusts, some of the directors actually had the ability to choose which concentrate to have, which company to go with. And there was a deal of profit that could be made by the hospital because there's one particular trust that I know of that the purchasers would pay a price for the concentrate, and the director of that trust, and I think it would be inappropriate for me to name names, I'm just explaining the system that could have gone on. The director of that trust had negotiated a price A. The purchaser was asked to pay a price A plus something or other. So that trust or that hospital made enormous profits out of haemophilia.
maybe something.
And I just have to say that, and that was not the case at the Royal Free, but the negotiation of contracts was very difficult because they had to negotiate with GPs sometimes, or small health authorities, and there was, I remember we had this is moving on a bit, but I think it's relevant. We had a little boy who sadly had an inhibitor, and the cost of his recombinant they were treated with a thing called recombinant 7A for inhibitors. I'm moving on a bit. But the cost of that child's care, which was totally appropriate and enabled that child to go to school and to do things which, you know, you hoped all children with haemophilia would be able to do, completely wiped out the whole budget of the authority that he lived in. And in my, which maybe we're moving on to, but that was the reason I wrote probably the BMJ leader about the economics of haemophilia care, that a single institution like the Royal Free that had 1/10 of all the people with inherited bleeding disorders in the country, the Royal Free was having to negotiate these contracts in order to get the money in to pay for the concentrate. It was very, very difficult, and it was a poor management system that had been brought in by the purchaser-provider divide that happened in the 90s.
We may come on to that, but I'm going to
Okay.
take you back to the first half of the 1980s, Professor Lee. We can see from this letter, and there are plenty of other examples of it, but that Dr. Kernoff, in contrast to what you've described of your own practice, and Dr. Colvin were actively involved in decisions about which concentrates to use. But I just want to explore with you some of the points he makes about the treatment policies at the Trust in this letter. So we can see in the second paragraph, the present buying policy of the Royal Free and London hospitals.
Can you move?
Yes, it's the second paragraph. It begins in essence. We can see that
Is this the letter to Mr. James?
Yes.
Well, I've only got the first line, is it? Oh, wait.
I'm
And
sorry.
number 2, we feel rather strongly that the contract should be shared.
Is that the only thing you can see on your screen?
Yes, I've only got down to that.
Let's just... I think the other screens have the...
Okay, now I've got the full letter.
Mine doesn't. Mine has exactly what Professor Lee has.
Mine has had the whole second half of the document. Are you able to read it in that form?
No,
Professor
it's
Lee?
just the letter. It's only got page 1.
Yes, well, we'll start with page 1 and then move on.
I now have the whole.
So if we pick it up in the second paragraph, we can see there that the present buying policy...
No, I still haven't got it. It just says, we feel rather strongly that the contract should be shared between 2 companies.
It was the same,
I
sir.
think the second paragraph, Professor Lee, on the page, begins in essence.
Well, I hadn't got that. It's
But
now
no,
come
I
up.
think you may have, if you go back. Have you got the start of the...
Oh, I see. Sorry, I was looking at number... It's got numbers 1
Yes,
and 2. I'm
yes.
sorry.
No,
Okay,
yes.
essence. Okay, sorry.
So we can see there the present buying policy of the Royal Free was described as sharing purchases between Immuno and Armour. So that's as at 1981. And then if we go back to the full letter, please, Henry. The next paragraph says, we have taken account of several factors other than the tender prices alone. So we can see that price was a factor for Dr. Kernoff. But then he says this, and I wanted to ask you about this. There is generally considered to be a medical hazard in exposing patients to a brand of concentrate which they have not previously received, in that the likelihood of contracting hepatitis seems to be increased. Our policy has therefore been to attempt to maintain individual patients on particular brands. Now, were you aware when you joined the Royal Free that that was the policy of the Royal Free?
Yes, that certainly was the policy, and the idea behind that policy was that maybe you could limit exposure. And throughout, we always had a policy that patients were kept on the same batch, the same number of concentrate, until that batch ran out.
And then if we could go on to the third page of the letter, please, Henry. We can see in the paragraph that's numbered 6, so towards the top of the page, Dr. Kernoff says this: in common with the directors of most other large haemophilia centres in the UK, I have in the past both sought and accepted financial support for research and educational purposes from all the companies now making tenders. We're currently receiving support from Immuno, who paid the publication costs of a Royal Free Haemophilia Centre handbook, which we're now selling to augment our research funds. The maintenance of our academic programme has always depended to some extent on assistance from commercial companies, and it is my intention to continue to seek such support and if funds are offered to accept them. Now, again, dealing with the period in the first half of the 1980s, so in terms of your work there, it would have been 1983, 1984 predominantly. Are you aware what funding was received from pharmaceutical companies by the centre or by Dr. Kernoff in that period?
No, I think the description in this letter I'm sure is true, but I didn't know the detail of it. This is 1980, isn't it?
It is. I'm just seeking to...
Yeah, I wasn't there.
I understand that, Professor Lee. I'm just seeking to establish from this what the position was in 1980.
I think it's highly likely. And again, I said that Dr. Kernoff was pretty much, as we said, a stickler for detail, and I'm sure he provided the information on which this document is based.
And then if we go to the next paragraph, please, Henry. We just have the whole of the next paragraph. So if we pick it up about halfway down, he says this: I do not view factor 8 simply as a commodity which forms part of a general hospital supplies list. It is an essential human blood component whose use is accompanied by serious risks to patients and whose methods of production by commercial companies are the subject of intense medical ethical and political controversy. Are those issues about medical, ethical and political controversies, are those matters which you and Dr. Kernoff ever discussed?
I don't know that I have specifically discussed with them, but I can understand from this letter, and I think what's also happening here is that we're in a transition period. The reason that initially the contracting was done through supplies, you know, who did everything from toilet papers to, I don't know, soap or whatever, was because it was blood, cryo, and all the blood it was supplies that did it. I mean, actually, I don't know when you had to start paying for blood. I'm sure you had to start paying for it by the time it became a trust. But what's happening is that you're transitioning into a drug, a therapeutic product from blood. And I think the managerial and financial implications of that change, that's why gradually, and by the time I got there, it changed from supplies to a pharmacy because you've got a drug. So I think what is written in this letter is true, but what you're asking me is, was I aware of that in 1980? No.
Really more, were you aware of it from your interactions with Dr. Kernoff from 1983 onwards, when you were working with him?
I don't know that we would have had discussions about purchasing products. It was, as you like, below my pay grade. I wasn't a consultant. I was a senior registrar. So I don't think I would have had any discussions with him.
I don't think the question is really about purchasing. It's about the nature of the commercial product. So the issue, I think, is whether you may or may not have discussed at any stage with...
You mean whether it's immuno or armour or what?
Whatever, just call it pharma, if you like, pharmaceutical.
No, I wouldn't have had those discussions in 1983.
Did you ever have discussions with Dr. Kernoff, whether in 1983 or later on during the 1980s, about what he talks there of being intense medical, ethical and political controversy? Methods of commercial production of concentrates?
I don't think so. I don't recall anything.
When you arrived in 1983, I was going to ask you for your assistance on, in broad terms, the treatment policies. You were able to assist the Lindsay Tribunal.
Sorry, in broad terms?
You're moving away from the microphone.
I'm so sorry. My apologies, Professor Lee. I'm going to ask you in broad terms about the treatment policies of the Royal Free in 1983-1984. So the matters that you were able to assist the Lindsay Tribunal on, I'm going to ask you about.
Could we have that the Lindsay Tribunal statement that I made, because
Absolutely.
that was made 20 years ago. At that time that I made that, I also had access to information within the centre, and it's very difficult for me to recall that now. So I'd be grateful if you would put up what I said to the Lindsay Tribunal.
Yes, I should say we don't have the written statement you provided to the Lindsay Tribunal, but we do have the transcript of your oral evidence, and we can have that on screen. Henry, it's LIND 0000326. If we go to page 15, I'm not going to ask you at the moment about specific parts of the transcript, but if we need to look at it, or you need to look at it to refresh your memory, we can find any useful sections. So, do you have any recollection of, broadly speaking, the proportion of patients in 1983 who would have been on home treatment at the Royal Free Centre?
No.
Do you know whether home treatment at the Royal Free Centre by 83-84, was that for adults and children, or just adults?
Both, I think.
Do you know whether it was home treatment was only used for patients with severe haemophilia A?
Yes, I know that because it's mostly the practice still today. You have to train somebody to treat themselves, and as many people in this room will attest, it's not easy. And if you're not doing it regularly, so somebody with mild haemophilia would, maybe not have a bleed or a problem. They'd have it very infrequently, so they would lose their practice. So you trained up the patients and, of course, the parents, which was not so easy. So the question you're asking me, whether it was the same for all patients, I think it was the severe patients who were on home treatment.
And then dealing first with adults with severe haemophilia as a cohort, what products, I don't mean the specific pharmaceutical companies, unless you can remember those, but what products were used for the treatment predominantly of adults with severe haemophilia A? Was it commercial concentrate or NHS concentrate or something else?
It's very difficult for me to be precise about this, but the generality of my memory, and I think what's recorded here, we were very fortunate to be able to have all our children on NHS concentrate. And that was really, I suppose, for two reasons. One is they're small, so there was not a supply problem. And the other is that although at that time there wasn't any evidence that NHS product was to be preferred, that we didn't have any evidence that commercial concentrate transmitted more than NHS concentrate, but many parents had an instinct that they would prefer NHS concentrate for their children. And that was done, and we were able to maintain that. And, in retrospect, it was fortunate, because I think the only child we had to care for with HIV actually acquired his infection, I think, abroad somewhere where he was given commercial concentrate. As far as the adults were concerned, I believe it was a mixture. But again, it's very difficult for me because I didn't make the decisions, and that wasn't my day-to-day work.
Yeah, again, this is territory that you largely covered in your Lindsay Tribunal evidence,
Yes.
so that's one of the reasons why I'm asking you.
But I would just remind you that at the time I gave the Lindsay Tribunal evidence, I actually was able to have access by telephone to the people within the centre to review the treatment records. And that information was not information that I remembered, or information that in that time period, or information that had been because of my decision, but I was able to get the evidence from records. And so that's, I hope I'm not appearing to be difficult, but I would really prefer for the what I said then to be taken as what was happening, because I can't remember after 20 years.
Yes, you'll appreciate not everyone would have had the opportunity of looking at the Lindsay transcript,
sorry.
which is one of the reasons for asking you in this forum. So, children NHS factor 8, adults with severe haemophilia, commercial concentrates or NHS concentrates, or both.
Yes.
In terms of adults with moderate or mild haemophilia, you said in your Lindsay evidence it was difficult to distinguish between the two, not diagnostically, but in terms of your recollection of treatments.
Yeah, I think just to clarify that, I mean, severe haemophilia is less, it's defined as less than 2%, but basically it's nothing. And non-severe haemophilia is above 2%.
So for adults with non-severe or mild or moderate haemophilia, what was the general approach to treatment for those adults?
I think we're talking about 83. So by then we did have access to DDAVP, I think.
Yes.
Professor Minucci's paper was published in 77, and I was actually quizzed on it during my MRC Path exam, so in the early 80s. So I think we had DDAVP by then. And DDAVP you can give to people who have non-severe factor 8 deficiency. You can't, of course, use it for anybody with factor 9 deficiency. It acts by raising the factor 8. You can also use it for people with von Willebrand's disease, but at that time we hadn't worked out what it was all about, von Willebrand's disease. And some people didn't respond and some people did respond, and it was only later that the different types emerged because we had molecular diagnosis. So DDAVP was beginning to be used where it was possible, but if, particularly in the context of von Willebrand's disease, I would say, if a patient had an enormous bleed, like some of the nosebleeds that people had, which are called epistaxis in the papers, it could be torrential. So to use DDAVP was just totally inappropriate, and there were also people who just didn't respond to it.
So for the patient who is a non-severe haemophiliac, and for whom you've judged that DDAVP would not be appropriate in those particular circumstances, what would be the next line treatment in 1983-84?
Factor 8.
Concentrates?
Yes.
Not cryoprecipitate?
No.
You told the Lindsay Tribunal, and we can look at this if we go to the next page. If we pick it up about to the third of the way down, you were asked the question, this here was about children, but you were asked the question, were any of your children receiving cryoprecipitate as distinct from concentrate? And you've said no. You say, I've carefully checked on that issue, and the only person with severe haemophilia A who received cryoprecipitate during that period was, if you like, a kind of conscientious objector who didn't want to have concentrate. So just pausing there, what did you mean by conscientious objector?
It was somebody who didn't want to have blood products. I don't think, is the conscientious objector the right word, actually? The parents didn't want any blood product.
Well, you describe it there as a patient who received cryoprecipitate. So someone who didn't want concentrates.
Yeah, I think, quite honestly, I think it's very difficult for me to remember precisely what that means.
Well, let me tell you how I read it. Somebody who, on principle, I think is the words I would replace kind of conscientious objector by, but on principle didn't want to have concentrate. Doesn't say what the principle is, but that's the sense of it that it conveys to me at the moment. Is that about right, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I do remember when I was giving the Lindsay Tribunal evidence, actually phoning back to the Royal Free for them to check, I think probably either the treatment records, the Oxford returns, or to find out that fact, because I was being asked that fact. And that was the information I got at the time, I think.
So that was the use of cryoprecipitate for a single severe haemophiliac. You were then asked whether for children or for adults, the choice was if somebody was a person with mild haemophilia and who could be treated with DDAVP, that was done, which is the answer you gave me a few moments ago. If not, they were treated with concentrate, either NHS or commercial, and you answered yes. Do you know why cryoprecipitate was not used as the second-line treatment for mild haemophiliacs if DDAVP was not an option?
Well, I think I partly have rehearsed the answer to this question in that the practicalities were very difficult. But more than that is the issue of exposure, that to treat a bleed, you need 10... well, what are we talking about? We're talking about...
Mild haemophiliac.
Mild haemophilia. No, I think it's more about the risk of not getting the right level and not having effective treatment. I think is probably the decision-making process here, and it relates to the fact that the factor 8 in the cryoprecipitate was not known, in that you couldn't measure it, and it would probably had a fall off by the time you got it into the person, and also it may also have been the issue of the bleed they got, that the treatment just wouldn't be so effective. But again, the decision-making process is Dr. Kernoff's. It's very difficult for me to know exactly how he came to that decision. And I think it would have been very difficult in some situations many situations, to use cryoprecipitate effectively and to stop the bleeding and to prevent the problem.
Was prophylaxis a feature of treatment at all at the Royal Free in the first half of the 1980s, or was that something that only came later?
No, prophylaxis. We started prophylaxis at the Royal Free in 1994. It depends in a way what you call prophylaxis. Regular prophylaxis for children was begun in 1994, where you gave 3 treatments a week to keep the level up to a certain level to stop bleeds. But sometimes there was a kind of prophylaxis used if people had a particularly important day, or that was in their life that they needed cover. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, for example, I suppose if you had a job interview, something like that. But it wasn't used widespread in the sense that we now know about prophylaxis.
Haemophilia B was the predominant treatment, NHS factor 9 concentrate.
Yes, and the reason for that is because it's a 1/6 less common than haemophilia A, and there was not a supply problem.
And then you've touched on this already, but von Willebrand's disease, what was the predominant mode of treatment in 1983-84?
Well, it depended what the bleed was, but if it was a severe bleed, it would be concentrate. And you would try and use DDAVP if you felt that was going to be effective.
Well, just look at the 1983 returns for the Royal Free, which would have been completed by Dr. Kernoff and or Dr. Tuddenham. Henry, it's HCDO 0000184_006. First of all, please. So we can see here, it's the annual return for 1983. The directors are identified as Dr. Kernoff and Tuddenham. Total number of haemophilia A patients treated during the year 128. Carriers of haemophilia A treated during the year 4. Total number of von Willebrand's disease patients treated during the year 24. And then if we look for haemophilia A patients, we can see for hospital treatment, there's an amount, 1,443 bags of cryoprecipitate, which I think someone's translated into units. And then we can see NHS factor 8 concentrate, 193,965 units for hospital treatment, and then the total used for home treatment that's given there, would that have been predominantly children, in all likelihood?
No, I don't think it would necessarily be all used for children. It seems quite a lot. I think there would have been adults who were on home treatment with NHS, not necessarily all of them. I don't know.
And then we can see the figures for the use of commercial products. So in that year, factor 8, co-8, haemophil and cryoblin were all used. The concentrate used most was factor 8, just over 1 million units hospital treatment and 1.2 million for home treatment. And then co-8, 1.2 million for home treatment. If we then go further down that, we can see porcine factor 8. I'll ask you a little more about porcine later, but what at that time was porcine factor 8 predominantly used for?
Inhibitor treatment.
And
it's important. I talked a bit about, or do you want to leave this for later, about porcine?
I think we'll come back to porcine
okay.
and one of the papers you wrote about it later, if we may, Professor Lee. And then we can see reference to some other products, including DDAVP. And then von Willebrand's disease, we can see cryoprecipitate was still being used for von Willebrand's disease, it would appear, in hospital. And then smaller amounts of NHS treatment used at hospital and home. If we can then go, please, up to HCDO 40184_051, please. I won't go through the details of the inhibitor treatments, Professor Lee, but we'll just look at haemophilia B. So this is the annual return for 1983 in relation to haemophilia B treatment. 31 patients treated during the year, 1 carrier treated, and we can see there that the bulk of the material used there is NHS factor 9 concentrate. Are you aware of 1983 representing any particular change in approach to treatment, or as far as you know, was this broadly consistent with what had been the treating practices at the Royal Free?
No, I just say again that I was a senior registrar in the department. These decisions and what was going on with the treatment was managed by the directors. So I think what is here, and I'm sure it's true.
We just look at WITN 0644070, please, Henry. This is a document from much later. It's 1995 document that you prepared. Could just go to page 20, which is the last page of this document, please. You provide there a table showing clotting factor concentrate obtained free in the context of therapeutic trials, and that gives figures from 1988 onwards to 1995, which was the date of the document, with a total value attributed to it of £1,572,000. Do you know what the position was at all pre-1988? Were clotting factor concentrates provided free to the Royal Free for therapeutic trials?
No, this covers the time period that I was in charge.
So you
I'm a consultant. I became a consultant in 1987. So prior to that, I don't know what was obtained.
Do you know at all? Again, I'm asking you now again about 1983-84. What the arrangements were at all for obtaining NHS concentrate? Was that?
No.
You don't. So you don't know whether that was from the Regional Transfusion Centre or directly from BPL?
No, I don't know.
You've alluded to the fact that there were there were possibly supply issues in relation to NHS Concentrate because you focused the supplies you had on children and then some for adults. Do you recall any more detail about what those supply issues were? Was it something you discussed with Dr. Kernoff or he discussed with you?
No, I do have memory that he tried to save up concentrate if he knew somebody had got to have an operation. That's the vague memory I have. But
NHS Concentrate.
I don't know which particular one it was. I just know that he would do that because I think there was a supply problem in general sometimes. But I think it's probably not appropriate that I make statements about this period because I would say again that I wasn't responsible for making any of these decisions. I wasn't looking after the patients that needed to have operation. It wasn't my job, you know. So I think what we have to do is rely upon what's in the returns and things. Right?
And your evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal,
Yes.
which
Yes,
you've said
which
would have been based upon more
what
up-to-date
is said
information.
in the Lindsay Tribunal, which, as I say, I said it 20 years ago. At the time that I said that, I cross-checked with people who were then alive, like the chief nurse in the unit, I phoned up and cross-referenced, and she checked out things, but. I think it's very difficult for me now to give reliable information about that period. I'm quite happy to give you the detail from when I was in charge in 1991 and how it was done. But I think it's unfair. It's probably unfair for Dr. Peter Kernoff to say why the decisions were making what he was doing, you know, because I don't know.
Professor Lee, to make it clear, I'm not asking you to speculate.
Yes, well, that's why I don't want to speculate.
The reason I'm asking these questions is because you told the Lindsay Tribunal that these were matters that you discussed, that you were to some extent privy to Dr. Kernoff's thinking, and you did give evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal about what the treatment policies were in broad terms in 1983 and 1984. Yes,
but what I would also say is that we are now in 2020. So this was 20 years ago. And I think the information that I provided for the Lindsay Tribunal at that time was what I remembered 20 years ago from 17 years before that. We're now 37 years, and I'm sorry. I think that what I said in the Lindsay Tribunal was as true as I knew at that time, and from my standpoint now, I stand by what I said. But I don't think it's fair for me to speculate in a way, because trying to remember back 37 years when I've been retired 15 is quite difficult for me. But what I said to the Lindsay Tribunal was true at that time.
Not only at that time.
Yeah, sorry.
So far as you know, you've just said that you think that you have no reason to think that anything said there was inaccurate.
No.
Thank you.
You've said Dr. Kernoff was a stickler for detail and for records. What, if any, policy or practice was in operation at the Royal Free during the 1980s for recording what particular products patients received and what particular batches patients received?
This is the 1990s.
1980s. You returned
1980s, okay. Well, I have explained to you that there were the beginnings of a computer in 79-80. But every patient had a treatment record, which was in addition to the medical record. And all the notes and all the treatment records were all kept in the Haemophilia Centre. And in those treatment records, which the patients had at home, and we had access to them in the centre, they had to record the date, the type of bleed, the number on the concentrate bottle, and how much used. They had those forms at home. Initially, they would post them back, and within the centre, they were filed in this treatment file. And of course, if we were administering treatment in the centre, because sometimes a patient might come up with a problem and they needed treatment in the centre, we would record in those treatment files. And gradually, from 1980 onwards, that treatment was put on the computer, which was a pretty primitive computer to start off with. And you showed us the records that were sent to Oxford. We called them the Oxford returns. And there are a large number of patients we looked after and a large amount of treatment. So that detail eventually was, we were able to put the numbers down because we had a computer. But it was still there in the records, and the data manager within the centre, Françoise Kendall, one of her big jobs was to go through these records and, add it all up. Gradually, we were able to appoint additional people in the centre. I think we had 2 people eventually. We were so lucky because the patients were so lucky. We had a big cold room where all the concentrate was kept. And eventually we had a good stock control, so there was a record of what's here, what numbers are here, what's gone. So I think that answers your question, does it?
Yes, the treatment records from the 1980s.
Yes.
That you've described, so the
Yes.
physical treatment records, and leaving aside whatever then might have been
Yes.
transposed to the computer, were they part of the patient's medical records, or were they kept separate?
No, they were. The medical record was, like we all remember medical records, was a big file. And then there was a separate folder which had these sheets of paper in. And within the centre, initially when I went there in 83, when there were less patients, we actually had a whole bank of filing cabinets, alphabetical filing cabinets, where these records were kept together. When we were able to have the new extension opened in 1994 by the Duchess of Kent, and in fact, just to add in, that was the last decision Peter was able to get out of the trust before he was ill. It wasn't a trust then, but the hospital, was to go forward with this extension. We were able to put in that extension, a huge area. It was about the size of this platform here, where the notes were put in filing cabinets, hanging filing cabinets, but the notes were with the treatment folder. So if you saw a patient, anybody saw a patient within the centre, they had those notes.
And when you retired in 2005, did those hard copy treatment records still exist?
Yes, I think it's a tragedy, actually. Those treatment records enabled us to have an enormous information about haemophilia, which wasn't just so that you would get publications. It was so that you could inform your care and understand what was happening. It was there on paper. Sadly, I think certainly the hospital record has now been computerized, because I know my Rule 9 requests, we've had to, get them. I don't know what's happened to the treatment records, and I tell you, it is a real tragedy. I mean, maybe they've been digitalised, I don't know.
Well, we can no doubt ask that question of the Royal Free. So I'm about to move on to a topic that won't be capable of being resolved within the next 2 to 3 minutes. So should we break for lunch now?
Yes, let's break for lunch until 2 o'clock. So an hour for lunch, back at 2 o'clock. The same rules apply as they do at any break.